Hello and welcome to another episode of the Stadium Showdown. I'm Jeff Slauson. The gloves are officially off. This week, we now know exactly where Haslams Sports Group stands as far as their relationship with Cuyahoga County, and they called in reinforcements to try and see if they can push this over the finish line and get the state funding for a new stadium. Yes, Commissioner Roger Goodell, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, flew to Columbus to meet with state lawmakers in an attempt to make sure they can get that $600 million of funding that has been requested from the Haslams, from the state. So let's break this down a little bit. We got statements both from the NFL and from the Haslams in relation to those meetings, and let's start with the NFL statement on this. So again, Commissioner Roger Goodell flying to Columbus and meeting with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle in the hope of trying to see if they can secure the funding. And this is what they had to say in part. Governor DeWine and the General Assembly have demonstrated tremendous leadership by working with the Browns on a plan for Ohio's first enclosed stadium, and we appreciated today's productive conversations. We look forward to working with the Browns to bring the Brook Park project to fruition. Now, for those that are thinking, oh, it's not that big of a deal that the commissioner would make a trip like this to try and see if they can secure funding, it kind of is. So I went back and looked at basically every single stadium that has been built over the last decade or so. I really couldn't find evidence that the commissioner made a trip to that state's capital to try and secure funding. In fact, the most recent one that I could find is related to the Buffalo Bills in Orchard Park, New York. The NFL's offices, their main offices, are in New York City. The state capital for the state of New York is in Albany. It's basically an hour train ride. According to records, there were only 2 phone calls between Roger Goodell and the governor of New York to secure funding. No in-person meeting, and definitely no meeting with lawmakers. So yeah, this is pretty unprecedented, and it does show that the NFL is very much so behind the Browns for that new stadium, but potentially that there is a concern that that funding would not go through. Now, there is a reason why there is such a force to try and make sure that this funding can come from the state, because there's concern that the county or others would not be able to provide their backing. And that is why the Haslams seemed pretty excited about this meeting. This was their response to the commissioners' meetings in Columbus. They say, and I quote, "We appreciate Commissioner Goodell joining us in Columbus to meet with Governor DeWine and other state leaders. We are grateful for his support as he understands the transformative impact such a project can have on Northeast Ohio and knows Browns fans deserve the same world-class fan experience that has become the standard across the NFL." So clearly, bringing in the big guns, bringing in the commissioner of the NFL to try and see if they can push this over the line is a very telling sign. Now, obviously, we do not know whether this will have an actual impact or not. It has passed the House, would need to pass the Senate, and then ultimately be signed by the governor for the funding to go through. The governor has very much so said that he wants his own plan to be passed in order for the stadium to actually be built, so we'll see which one actually comes to fruition. But the question remains, if the NFL was brought in to try and help push this over the line, is there a chance that the NFL is considering the Browns for bigger events, namely the Super Bowl? Well, there's always a chance, but what requirements would have to be met is very important here. And what you're going to see through the actual list of requirements that have to happen for any place to be considered for a Super Bowl, this sounds a lot like the new Brook Park plan here. So let's go through this. First of all, whenever a Super Bowl is determined, it is voted on by the owners. And to be considered, all of these need to be hit. Of course, that area needs to have an NFL team, or basically an NFL stadium, within their area. They're not going to put a Super Bowl in a spot that doesn't have an NFL team to host. Second, there would have to be a minimum of 70,000 seats at that stadium. That is the exact number, essentially, that the new Brown Stadium would be at. There would need to be media and electrical amenities that are in place to be able to host the thousands of journalists and thousands of reporters that are coming from around the world for the event. This one's interesting. The stadium/area has to have an average game day temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit or above. Or the stadium needs to be domed. Sound familiar? There would need to be 35,000 parking spaces within 1 mile of the stadium. There would need to be equal team facilities for both teams playing in the Super Bowl within 20 miles drive of the team's hotels. There would need to be 25,000 or more hotel spaces within 1 hour's drive of the stadium. And lastly, the area that is chosen must have entertainment areas that are built for experiences. Think for sponsors. They need to have an area to be able to host events. What the Browns are planning would absolutely have that entertainment district, at least in part, around that area. Now, again, we do not know if the NFL has said whether or not the Browns would be strongly considered for a Super Bowl, but every dome that we have seen that's been built over the last few years, all those teams have been able to celebrate a Super Bowl at their home area. So very clearly they'd be able to put their name forward. If the stadium were to be built, they would cross every single one of those requirements. That meeting in Columbus was not the only movement we saw from Haslam Sports Group this week. The next day, following the meetings, they released a letter that was sent to Cuyahoga County explaining all of the reasons why they believe the county is out of touch and why they believe this stadium absolutely has to be built. That explosive letter coming up after the break. Welcome back. It was a letter sent from Haslam Sports Group to Cuyahoga County Executive Chris Ronayne that showed exactly where the Haslams stand as far as why they feel that the county has been a massive roadblock to future success, not only for the Browns, but for the county as a whole. In fact, this letter goes through every single bit of evidence that they believe would show why the county should be excited about a new dome and why they say they actually can go on without the county, whether they provide funding or not. Brian Duffy and Dan DeRose break this down more.
Hi, everyone. Brian Duffy along with Dan DeRose here. And Dan, pretty scathing letter here that the Haslam Sports Group has now sent to the Cuyahoga County Executive, Chris Ronayne. We've been through a lot of issues in this stadium showdown. This letter, though, this letter to me is crucial because it basically states that they're building this stadium. They are going to build that whether the county gets on board or not. There's 10 or so points here. You're going to walk us through the most important points in this letter.
Right, and the letter basically calls out the county executive and says, look, we have tried to work with you. They do say we will work with you if you get on board for Brook Park. And in this letter, they basically call out Chris Ronayne. It is truly disheartening to see you as county executive actively work against a potential $600 million investment from the state that would be paired with $2 billion in private investment for an unprecedented $3 billion economic development project centrally located in Cuyahoga County. The letter goes on to say, these are the types of inexplicable decisions that keep the greater Cleveland region from thriving while other regions like Columbus and Cincinnati continue to grow and evolve. Wow.
Yeah, that is enormous. And I think the two things are there inexplicable decisions. Then the other thing was the investment that they're making. We've never seen anybody make a private investment. Now there's got to be public investment, but the Haslams are investing $1.5 billion to build this stadium, plus the money that they're going to spend on around the stadium.
And I want to look at this Columbus and this Cincinnati idea. Remember when they announced the Intel project, that plant just outside of Columbus that's going to build microchips? That was a major, major investment. And at the time, we were all saying, well, why can't something like that happen in Cleveland? This is something like that. A $3 billion project would be the largest ever economic development project in Northeast Ohio history. That's how large this is. Now, the county did respond. Not so much Chris Ronayne, but we did get a really lame generic response from the county, basically saying, Cuyahoga County has evaluated the unrealistic assumptions made in the Haslam Sports Group stadium proposal in Brook Park. We urge state lawmakers to consider the public and private investments throughout Northeast Ohio that stand to be negatively impacted by a stadium and entertainment district in Brook Park built with an unprecedented level of public subsidy. Instead, we ask them to invest in our existing assets on the lakefront. And I want to be clear about the statement we got in regards to that letter. This statement from the county was almost word for word the letter that was sent to state senators 2 weeks ago. They couldn't even come up with a new explanation after getting blasted by the Haslam Sports Group.
Right. It just looks like it's a question of how the financing is going to come together at this point. That's really it. And there's still a number of things going on. We know all that. We've talked all about them. That's really the only question. The Haslams are moving forward. It appears this indoor stadium is going to get built.
I mean, we haven't even gotten to the court issue, but do the courts just wipe this out if they put a shovel in the ground? This is really interesting, but this was sort of a nail in the coffin, a final shot across the bow saying, Chris Ronayne, you either get on board with Brook Park or we're doing it without you.
Right. Certainly sounds like it. Okay. Thanks, Dan. Jeff.
Now, the county did respond to the Haslam's letter, saying, in quote, Cuyahoga County has evaluated the unrealistic assumptions made in HSG's stadium proposal in Brook Park and has come to the same conclusion as the nonpartisan Legislative Services Commission and the state's Office of Budget and Management. The request will create an unacceptable amount of risk for taxpayers in Cuyahoga County and in Ohio. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's because it is. Last week, we showed you the letter from Cuyahoga County and the mayor's office that was sent to the Senate, asking them not to approve funding. And that statement said, Cuyahoga County has evaluated the assumptions made in the HSG proposal and has come to the same conclusion as the Legislative Services Commission and the State Office of Budget and Management, that the proposal is too risky and is a risk that the voters of Cuyahoga County and the state of Ohio should not assume. It's almost word for word. There's a couple of words added into the statement, but it's basically the same thing. We pressed the county consistently for a comment on this, and yeah, this is what they provided. Basically the exact same statement as the week before, despite the Haslams directly calling out Cuyahoga County and the county executive, saying they are preventing progress. And of course, if you are looking to watch any other previous coverage of the Stadium Showdown, go ahead, scan the QR code on your screen right now. Best way to be able to see any of our previous coverage. Again, that available at cleveland19.com. And coming up after the break, just when you think the state can't provide any more funding for the stadium project, some new legislation shows up. That after a short break. Welcome back. A proposal to amend the state budget, removing the Browns funding, just announced by Senator Casey Weinstein. And moments ago, I spoke with him about exactly why he feels this is necessary and how he sees this playing out.
I do see value in the project. It's just the huge ask that they're making of my constituents and Ohioans, combined with the cuts that we're making to the Ohioans that I serve, that have really pushed this over the edge for me. Folks were not receptive of the message of the Haslams, who are worth almost $10 billion, basically getting a handout from the state, while at the same time we're cutting library funding, we're cutting H2 Ohio funding, we're cutting public school funding, we're cutting suicide crisis funding, we're cutting childhood cancer research funding. I could go on and on about the cuts that we're making, and it just sends a terrible message to the Ohioans that I serve about who's got a seat at the table and how do they get there.
Hearing about, I'm guessing you heard about Commissioner Goodell.
Oh, I heard.
Yeah. Did that play at all into your decision here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just who gets the last word, and it's the Haslams and it's the commissioner sitting there with, legislative leaders and the governor. And it's just who's not at the table, right? The people of Ohio. And I can tell you, I've got a fairly significant following across my pages, and people are really actively commenting on this, and it is not a partisan issue. People are upset about this from across the ideological spectrum, whether they are, Republican, Democrat, old, young, Browns fans or not. People are upset about this. It just, it is the optics and the actual, the money, where it's really hard to tell my constituents that we've got enough money to make interest payments on the Haslams and the Browns loan while we're cutting funding for their public schools, which will cause a tax shift and more taxes for them when schools have to go for levies to make up the difference. Just, I can't tell that to my constituents.
We did reach out to the state and the governor's office following when we had seen your post here, and I do want to just get your response. Dan Tierney, in his response, said the governor's funding proposal avoids using the general revenue fund nor increasing taxes on any individual Ohioan, so it will resolve many of Senator Weinstein's stated issues in the thread. So would you accept something like the governor's proposal that does not use the general revenue fund or increase taxes?
I think the governor's proposal was a better solution by having a dedicated fund to this. That said, that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a House budget from what was sent to us. I have to deal in what we have on the table right now. And what we've got on the table is a budget that the House amended from the governor, took out his approach, put in public financing, paid out by the general revenue fund. And that's the reality that I'm operating under right now. And so while I appreciate the governor's approach, that's not the budget that we have before us right now.
Another reality is you and your Democratic colleagues are in the stark minority on this. Do you feel like you could get potential support from the other side of the aisle on this, or no?
That's a really good question. Here's what I'll say. My constituents, whether staunchly conservative or liberal, are pretty united as I've ever seen across the ideological spectrum here. I feel really good about how I vetted this issue in front of my voters. I've listened to them, whether it be in town halls or over coffee, or messages that they send me through digital, through social media, emails, calls, visits to my office, and the response has been as unified as I've ever seen for an issue before us. So I hope that my colleagues across the aisle are doing the same and are listening to their voters, because I think they'll get the same message, whether they're representing a more Democratic or Republican-leaning district. I'm pretty confident I have a sense of where Ohioans are on this issue, and it's just, this is a no for them.
It's a topic that has grown in popularity since the introduction of sports gambling in the state of Ohio. It's called iGaming, and as Dan DeRose explains, there's a chance that the funding from that could help the Browns build a new stadium.
This is interesting legislation, but what may be more interesting is the timing on this. They've been talking about iGaming or internet gaming in Columbus for about a year, but it's only now that the legislation has been introduced and it may be fast-tracked. What is iGaming? Well, we're not talking about just playing slots and blackjack and poker on your phone. Now you will be able to gamble on it, on your phone, your tablets, your computers, anything. And it's been passed in about 10 states already, and it is with phenomenal money-making opportunities. In Michigan in 2024, where it is legal to gamble on things like lottery and blackjack and poker on your phone, in tax revenue alone last year, they took in $451 million. Our neighbors to the east took in even more, $841 million. It is estimated that Ohio would probably come in somewhere around $800 million. Now, Representative Bride Rose Sweeney, the Democrat out of Westlake, she has introduced legislation that said if we take in any new money, it should go towards public education, publicly funded childcare, and problem gambling programs. But when you look at the Republicans' opportunity here, a pot of $800 million, where could that money go? I did ask Representative Bride Rose Sweeney if the potential for this money could be for stadium projects like Brook Park. Is there any chatter that with this millions and millions of dollars that would be raised, could this be the funding source for something like a Brook Park Stadium project? And if that's what Republicans suggest, I'm assuming you are going to be completely against that since you want it for K through 12 in the other two areas.
You are correct. I am not privy to what they are suggesting, but I do not think it's out of the realm of possibilities that if in fact they do legalize iGaming in short order, that could be something that they fund as something similar to what the governor did with those the other sports betting dollars. And we do know that there is a special committee that was created on gaming to do iGaming that is happening today. And so I hope those questions are being answered. And yes, if we are not funding our schools and our children and our families, then that should be our first priority before we are funding stadiums. I don't think that should be a controversial topic. I'm not essentially against having a pot of money to make sure that local municipalities and those taxpayers are on the hook. But our job, my job as a state lawmaker, is to make sure that we are doing our due diligence. It is in the Ohio Constitution that is the state of Ohio's job to fund public schools. Nowhere in that Constitution does it say it's our job to fund stadiums. That comes secondarily after we do our first duty, which is to protect and care for all Ohioans, but especially the children in Ohio.
While this legislation was just introduced, it does look like they are trying to fast track it. There are already a couple of committee meetings being held next week, and it could be voted on by the time the budget gets to the governor's desk at the end of June. Dan DeRose, 19 News.
All right, Dan, thanks so much. And now's the time of our show where we answer your questions. Just one question today because I want to be able to explain this in full here. This comes courtesy of Lima Kilo. Has anyone been in contact with Cleveland Hopkins Air Traffic Control? The FAA would have to provide their input, risk assessment, obstruction issues, terrain clearance, etc. regarding building the stadium so close to the airport. So a reminder for those that are semi-unfamiliar with where this lot is, it's basically bordering Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. So yeah, that does mean there are restrictions. However, that does not mean that the Browns would have to actually meet with the FAA. The FAA has clearance restrictions, but it's pretty ironclad. So that's where the plans come in handy here. The Browns have planned for the stadium to be built basically down into the ground and only be 100 feet high. That would then be in compliance with FAA regulations. So when you would enter the dome, you would walk down to get to your seats. Basically, at the surface level, when you're walking in, you're around at the 300 level. You're almost to the top of the stadium. The roof would extend, again, up to 100 feet above your head, but still, that would be far less than what you're normally used to, where the current Brown Stadium is built up out of the ground. This one would be built into the ground. So that's how they would get around it. And yeah, they actually wouldn't have to meet with Hopkins as long as they are under that restriction. The 100 feet would absolutely cover that, and they'd be okay to continue the build. Of course, if you have any questions at home, go ahead, scan the QR code on our screen right now. If you have a question, we love to be able to answer it. Ones like that, very interesting, right? You want to know